I had been looking forward to this vacation for months. After spending weeks buried in legal battles, taking down corporate criminals, and exposing corruption, I was desperate for a break. My wife and kids were just as excited. We had planned everything down to the last detail: a luxury beachfront resort in Hawaii, daily snorkeling trips, and an itinerary packed with nothing but relaxation. I left my phone on silent, determined to enjoy every second without any distraction from work. The first few days were perfect. The ocean breeze, the warm sun on my face, the sound of my kids laughing as they played in the sand. It was exactly what I needed. My wife and I sipped cocktails by the pool, finally unwinding after months of chaos. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. That peace didn't last long. I was lounging in a cabana, watching the sunset, when my phone started vibrating relentlessly. I ignored it at first, assuming it was some spam call or a minor work email, but then it rang again and again. I finally picked it up, annoyed that someone was trying so hard to reach me while I was on vacation. When I saw Greg's name on the screen, I relaxed a little. Greg was my neighbor, a good guy, the kind of person who would watch over my house while I was gone. Maybe he needed to borrow my lawnmower again. "Hey man, what's up?" I answered, still half distracted by the waves crashing on the shore. There was silence on the other end, and then Greg let out a shaky breath. "I don't know how to tell you this," he started, his voice strained, "but your house is gone." I sat up so fast that my drink spilled all over my shorts. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" I asked, already feeling my stomach twist into a knot. "I mean, the HOA bulldozed it. It's just rubble now," he said. I could hear the disbelief in his voice. It was the kind of thing that didn't seem real, like something out of a nightmare. "That's impossible," I said, gripping the phone tighter. My house was up to code. I had every permit, every approval. There was no way they could have legally torn it down. Greg hesitated before speaking again. "I don't know, man. All I know is that a construction crew showed up this morning. They had an order signed by the HOA. I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen. The whole thing was flattened in a few hours." My mind raced, trying to process what I was hearing. This had to be a mistake. Maybe Greg had the wrong house. Maybe it was some kind of mix-up. But then he sent the pictures. My hands shook as I opened the messages. There it was, my house, reduced to a pile of debris. The porch, the windows, the roof, the fence, all of it destroyed. The only thing still standing was my mailbox, leaning awkwardly to one side, like a cruel joke. My wife must have seen the look on my face because she immediately asked what was wrong. I showed her the pictures, and she gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The kids were still playing in the pool, unaware that their home had just been erased from existence. "I'm booking the next flight out," I told her, my voice cold and steady. I didn't feel anger yet. Not yet. Just a deep, simmering rage buried beneath my disbelief. "Greg, I need you to find out who approved this," I said into the phone. "Who signed off on it? Who gave the order?" "Already on it," he said. I could hear papers shuffling on his end. "But man, I got to warn you, something feels off about this." I ended the call and started packing my bags. My wife followed suit, her hands shaking as she shoved clothes into the suitcases. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I zipped up my bag and looked her straight in the eye. "I'm going to make them pay for this. Every single one of them." The flight home felt like the longest flight of my life. I spent every minute going over everything in my head. I knew my rights. I knew the law. There was absolutely no way this could have been legal. The HOA might have had power over landscaping violations and fence heights, but demolishing an entire house, that was an entirely different level of insanity. When we landed, I didn't even bother going home. There was no home to go to. Instead, I drove straight to the HOA office, my wife beside me, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The office was a small, pristine building at the center of our neighborhood, a symbol of the HOA's control over every little thing. I marched inside, barely registering the receptionist's nervous expression as I demanded to see the president, Marjorie Whitmore. The self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood sat behind a massive oak desk, sipping a latte like she hadn't just destroyed my entire life. She looked up at me and smirked. "Oh, you're back. Did you have a nice trip?" I slammed the photos onto her desk so hard that her cup rattled. "Explain this," I said, my voice calm, too calm. She barely glanced at the pictures. "Oh, that." She took another sip of her drink. "You violated HOA regulations. We had no choice but to demolish it." I could feel my pulse in my ears. "That's a lie. My house was up to code. I had written approvals." She shrugged. We reviewed it again and decided otherwise. The decision was final. Then she slid a document across the desk, a demolition order signed by a judge. Or at least, that's what she wanted me to believe. I picked up the paper and examined it. The judge's signature was a forgery. The entire document was fake. My legal mind kicked into high gear, recognizing the fraud instantly. You forged this, I said, my voice like steel. Marjorie just smiled. Prove it. That's when I knew this wasn't just about my house. This was bigger. The HOA was running a scam, and they had no idea who they had just messed with. I took a slow breath, setting the paper back on her desk. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Her smirk faltered for the first time. Oh, and why is that? Because I'm a federal prosecutor, I said. And you just committed a crime. Her face turned ghost white. I turned on my heel and walked out, my mind already formulating my next move. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. I drove away from the HOA office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My wife sat beside me, silent, but I could feel the tension rolling off her in waves. The reality of our situation had settled in. Our home was gone, reduced to nothing but rubble. The place where we had raised our kids, celebrated birthdays, and built our lives had been destroyed by a corrupt homeowners association that thought it was above the law. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The moment I got home, if you could even call it that anymore, I stepped out of the car and stood in front of what used to be our house. The sight of it made my stomach churn. It looked like a bomb had gone off. Pieces of wood and drywall littered the ground. Broken glass sparkled in the dirt, and the remnants of our furniture were crushed beneath the wreckage. I took a deep breath, swallowing my rage. My wife placed a hand on my arm, her fingers trembling. I turned to look at her, seeing the devastation in her eyes. We have nowhere to go, she whispered. I knew that wasn't true. We had money. We could rent a place, stay in a hotel, even move into my parents' house for a while if we needed to. But that wasn't the point. The point was that this should have never happened. Someone had to pay. I pulled out my phone and dialed Greg. He answered on the first ring. I need every piece of information you can get on Marjorie Whitmore and the HOA board, I said, wasting no time. I need meeting records, financial transactions, anything that looks even remotely shady. Greg hesitated. Man, I was going to tell you. Something isn't right. I started digging the second you called me, and I found out that you're not the first person this has happened to. My jaw tightened. What do you mean? There have been at least 3 other homeowners who mysteriously lost their homes in the last few years. The HOA always had some excuse: violations, unpaid fines, zoning issues. But every time, the houses were demolished, and the land was either sold or turned into community property. That was all I needed to hear. This wasn't just an overreaching HOA flexing its power. This was a criminal operation. I needed proof, real, undeniable proof, and I was going to get it. The next morning, I got to work. I spent hours researching HOA laws, gathering every piece of documentation I had from when I bought the house, including all my approved permits. I compiled a list of past homeowners who had lost their properties and contacted each one of them. Their stories were eerily similar to mine. Claims of violations they had never been made aware of, sudden demolitions while they were away, and no way to fight back. The HOA had been running this scam for years, preying on homeowners who didn't have the resources to fight them. By the afternoon, I had more than enough to take the next step. I headed straight to the courthouse and filed a federal lawsuit against the HOA, naming Marjorie Whitmore as the primary defendant. I didn't stop there. I also reached out to law enforcement, sending them everything I had found: fraud, forgery, destruction of property, conspiracy. There were enough charges here to put Marjorie and her entire board behind bars. When I got back to what was left of my house, Greg was waiting for me. He had a folder in his hands, his expression grim. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing it over. I opened it and scanned the pages inside: bank statements, invoices, and transaction records, all linked to the HOA's accounts. It didn't take me long to realize what I was looking at. They were embezzling money, I muttered, flipping through the documents. Yep, Greg confirmed. They've been collecting fines, jacking up HOA fees, and using the money to pay themselves ridiculous salaries. And the worst part? They are selling off the demolished properties and pocketing the profits. I stared at the papers in my hands, my pulse quickening. This was it. The smoking gun. This wasn't just a case of overreach. This was organized fraud, and I had the evidence to prove it. The next morning, I called my contacts at the FBI. I had worked with them many times in my career, and I knew they wouldn't ignore something like this. By the afternoon, federal agents were reviewing the evidence, and I could already see the wheels turning. The HOA board had no idea that the noose was tightening around their necks. 2 days later, Marjorie called me. I had been expecting it. "You have no idea what you're doing," she snapped the second I answered. "Do you really want to go to war over this?" I smirked, leaning back in my chair. "Oh, Marjorie, I'm not going to war. I already won." She scoffed. "You think you can take us down? You're one man. The HOA is a legal entity. You can't just—" I cut her off. "I've already filed a lawsuit. I've already contacted law enforcement. And by the way, the FBI has your financial records. How do you think this ends for you?" Silence. You should have seen her face when the federal agents showed up at her house later that evening. I watched from a distance as she was let out in handcuffs, screaming about how this was all a mistake. Her minions were next. One by one, the HOA board members were arrested, their crimes laid out in black and white. I stood there watching, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. They had thought they could destroy my life. They had thought they could steal from people and get away with it. They had thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. As I turned to leave, Greg walked up beside me, grinning. "So, what's next?" he asked. I smiled. Now? Now I rebuild. But not before I make sure every last one of them gets what they deserve. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about justice, and I was going to make sure they never did this to anyone again. I spent the next few days preparing for the legal battle that was about to unfold. Even though the FBI had already arrested Marjorie and her fellow board members, that was just the beginning. The criminal case would take time to go through the system, but my civil lawsuit was another beast entirely. I wasn't just looking for compensation. I wanted to expose everything they had done, not just to me, but to every homeowner they had scammed over the years. The first thing I did was compile all the evidence into a structured case file. I worked tirelessly, going through every email, every financial transaction, and every document I had managed to get my hands on. Greg had been a huge help, digging up old HOA records that showed just how deep the corruption ran. It wasn't just that they had been demolishing homes illegally. They had also been inflating fines, misusing community funds, and lining their own pockets while claiming to be improving the neighborhood. Once I had everything in order, I met with my lawyer to go over the details of the lawsuit. Normally, I would have handled it myself, given my background as a federal prosecutor, but I knew that representing myself in a case this personal wasn't the best idea. My lawyer, a sharp and aggressive litigator named Daniel Kata, listened intently as I laid out the case. When I finished, he let out a low whistle and shook his head. "This is one of the most blatant cases of HOA corruption I've ever seen," he said, flipping through the documents. "They didn't even try to hide it. They thought no one would fight back." I replied, leaning back in my chair. "That's the problem with people like this. They get away with it for so long that they start thinking they're untouchable." Daniel nodded. "Well, they're about to learn otherwise. I'll get the lawsuit filed immediately. Given the scope of this, I wouldn't be surprised if other homeowners start coming forward once they see what's happening." That was exactly what I was hoping for. If other victims came forward, it would strengthen the case and put even more pressure on the courts to take action. Sure enough, within days of the lawsuit being filed, more homeowners started speaking up. Some of them had been fined into bankruptcy, while others had been forced to sell their homes for pennies on the dollar. The more stories that surfaced, the worse things looked for the HOA. The media caught wind of the lawsuit soon after, and suddenly my fight against the HOA became national news. News channels ran segments exposing their corruption, interviewing former residents who had been victimized. Social media exploded with outrage, with people sharing their own horror stories about homeowners associations across the country. The public was on my side, and that gave me even more leverage. Marjorie and her board members had been released on bail while awaiting trial, but that didn't mean they were off the hook. The pressure was mounting, and they knew it. One by one, board members started flipping, cutting deals with the prosecution in exchange for reduced sentences. They turned over documents, emails, and secret meeting notes, revealing just how calculated their scheme had been. Marjorie, however, refused to go down without a fight. She hired a high-powered defense attorney and started trying to spin the narrative, claiming that everything had been done by the book and that she was being unfairly targeted. She even went so far as to claim that I had a personal vendetta against her and that my lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to ruin her life. I wasn't worried. The evidence spoke for itself. There were forged signatures, illegal transactions, and blatant fraud. No amount of spin could change that. But what really sealed the deal was when we got our hands on the internal emails between Marjorie and the other board members. In those emails, they openly discussed their plans to push out certain homeowners, increase fines to maximize their personal earnings, and manipulate property values for their own benefit. They had treated the neighborhood like their own personal kingdom, and now their own words were coming back to haunt them. During the depositions, Marjorie tried to play innocent, claiming that she had no knowledge of the financial misconduct. But when confronted with the emails, some of which had been sent directly from her account, she had no answers. Her smug attitude vanished, replaced by visible panic as she realized there was no way out. The civil trial was set to begin in a few months, but even before that, settlement offers started rolling in. The HOA's legal team knew they had no chance of winning in court, so they were scrambling to limit the damage. They offered me a sizable payout to drop the case, hoping to make the problem go away quietly. I refused. It wasn't about the money, it was about accountability. I wasn't just going after a payout. I was going after justice, and I wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else again. Meanwhile, the fallout from the lawsuit sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The HOA had been completely dismantled, and a court-appointed administrator had taken over to clean up the mess. Homeowners who had been wrongfully fined or evicted were coming forward with their own claims, demanding restitution. Property values, which had been artificially manipulated for years, started to stabilize. The entire neighborhood was going through a massive transformation, and it was all because Marjorie and her cronies had gotten too greedy. One day, as I was leaving my lawyer's office, I spotted Marjorie in the parking lot. She looked completely different from the arrogant woman I had confronted in the HOA office. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, her hair was unkempt, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She saw me and hesitated before walking over. "You got what you wanted," she said bitterly. "Are you happy now?" I looked at her for a long moment before replying. "This was never about what I wanted, Marjorie. This was about what was right." She scoffed, shaking her head. "I built that HOA. I ran it for years, and now it's gone." "Because you ran it like a criminal empire," I said simply. "You destroyed people's lives for money. You thought you were untouchable, but no one is above the law." She said nothing, just stood there, her face tight with anger and regret. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. As I watched her go, I felt no sympathy. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. The legal battle was far from over, but I had already won the most important fight. The neighborhood was free from her control, the truth had come out, and justice was finally being served. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The legal battle had turned into a spectacle that was bigger than I had ever imagined. The entire country was watching as the corrupt HOA board crumbled under the weight of its own deceit. The lawsuits were stacking up, the media was covering every update, and homeowners across the nation were realizing that they didn't have to accept the abuse of power that so many HOAs had been getting away with for years. My case had become a symbol, and the pressure was mounting on every side. Despite the growing attention, I kept my focus on what mattered most, ensuring that every person responsible for the destruction of my home and the countless other scams was held accountable. The civil case was moving forward, and my legal team had more than enough evidence to destroy any defense the HOA might try to mount. Marjorie and the remaining board members were still trying to delay, hoping to negotiate a settlement that would let them escape with as little damage as possible, but I wasn't going to let that happen. The day before the next court hearing, I received another call from my lawyer. He had just come out of a meeting with the HOA's legal team, and he was practically laughing when he spoke. "They are desperate," he told me. "They know they are going to lose, and they're offering a huge payout to make this go away quietly. They think you're just after the money." I knew they would try something like this. I asked him how much they were offering, not because I was considering it, but because I wanted to know just how much they thought their crimes were worth. When he told me the amount, I almost laughed. It was a lot of money, more than enough to rebuild my house twice over, but it wasn't even close to what they owed, not just to me, but to everyone they had scammed. "Tell them no deal," I said firmly. "We're taking this all the way." That was the moment I knew they were finished. They had no real defense. Every argument they had tried to make had already been dismantled. The fraudulent demolition order, the illegal fines, the fabricated violations. Everything they had done was laid bare. The court wasn't going to rule in their favor, and they knew it. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse to find a swarm of reporters waiting outside. The case had gained even more traction in the past few weeks, and people were eager to see how it would end. I didn't stop to talk to the press, but I could hear the speculation as I walked by. Some were wondering if I would take a last-minute deal. Others were discussing how this case could change HOA regulations across the country. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Homeowners from my neighborhood had come to watch, many of whom had been wronged by the HOA in one way or another. Some had lost money. Others had been forced to make unnecessary repairs just to avoid fines, and a few had even been pushed out of their homes through years of harassment. They were all here, waiting for justice. Marjorie sat at the defense table, looking more exhausted than ever. She had aged 10 years in the last few weeks, the stress of the trial and the public backlash taking its toll. She still tried to put on an air of confidence, but there was no hiding the truth. She knew this was the end. The hearing began, and my lawyer wasted no time laying out our case. He presented document after document proving that the HOA had been running an organized scheme to defraud homeowners. He walked the judge through the financial records, showing exactly how much money had been stolen. Then he played recordings from the depositions where former board members admitted under oath that they had been part of the plan to demolish homes under false pretenses. Marjorie's lawyer tried to argue that she had been unaware of the full extent of the fraud, but that defense fell apart quickly. The emails alone were enough to prove that she had been the mastermind behind everything. The judge didn't even try to hide his disdain for what had happened. After hours of testimony, the judge called for a recess before making his ruling. I stepped outside to get some air, knowing that this was the moment everything had been leading up to. Greg found me near the courthouse steps, grinning from ear to ear. "This is it, man," he said. "She's done." I nodded. It had been a long, exhausting fight, but we were finally at the finish line. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge wasted no time delivering his verdict. He ruled in my favor, awarding me full damages for the destruction of my home. But more importantly, he ordered a full financial audit of the HOA and ruled that every homeowner who had been wrongfully fined or evicted was entitled to compensation. The HOA, which had once been an untouchable force in our neighborhood, was officially dismantled. Marjorie sat there in stunned silence as the judge handed down his decision. It was over. The scam was exposed, the corruption laid bare, and justice finally served. As I walked out of the courthouse, I took a deep breath, letting the weight of it all settle in. Reporters rushed toward me, microphones and cameras pointed in my direction, but I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about my wife, my kids, and the new home we would build without the shadow of a corrupt HOA hanging over us. That evening, as I sat with my family, we finally allowed ourselves to celebrate. My wife hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes, as she whispered, "We did it." The kids, too young to fully understand everything that had happened, cheered when I told them we would be getting a new house. The battle had been long, but we had won. A few days later, Greg called me with some unexpected news. "You're not going to believe this," he said, barely containing his laughter. "What is it?" I asked, curious. "Marjorie tried to move into a new neighborhood," he said, "but the HOA there rejected her application." I couldn't help but laugh. After everything she had done, after all the lives she had ruined, she was finally getting a taste of her own medicine. I leaned back in my chair, shaking my head. "Karma," I said simply. Greg chuckled. "Yeah, man. Karma." The fight was over. The damage was done, but justice had been served. The neighborhood was free. The homeowners finally had control over their own properties, and Marjorie was left to deal with the consequences of her greed. I had started this battle thinking I was just trying to get back what was mine, but in the end, I had taken down an entire corrupt system, and that was worth more than anything money could buy. The dust had finally settled after months of legal battles, public scrutiny, and relentless fighting. I had won. My home was gone, but the justice I had delivered to the corrupt HOA was worth more than any house. My lawsuit had destroyed their operation, exposed their crimes, and ensured that every victim of their fraudulent schemes received compensation. The HOA, once a feared and controlling entity in the neighborhood, no longer existed. Instead, a court-appointed administrator was overseeing what was left of its affairs, cleaning up the mess they had left behind. The power was finally back in the hands of the homeowners, where it should have been all along. With the legal battles behind me, my focus shifted to rebuilding. I had been awarded more than enough in damages to build a new home, but something about returning to the same lot didn't sit right with me. That place had been tainted by the HOA's corruption, and I didn't want any lingering memories of what had happened. My wife and I talked for hours about our next steps, weighing the idea of staying in the neighborhood versus moving somewhere new. The answer came to me one evening while walking through the wreckage of our old home. The lot was empty now, cleared of debris, nothing but dirt and scattered patches of grass. It didn't feel like a home anymore, but it also didn't feel like a place I wanted to sell to someone else. That's when the idea hit me. Instead of rebuilding for myself, I would turn the space into something for the community. A few weeks later, after working through the necessary approvals and permits, the plans were finalized. The lot where my house once stood was transformed into a public dog park. It was simple but meaningful, a place where people could come together free of the HOA's control, a symbol of everything we had fought for. Greg was the first to visit, bringing his 2 golden retrievers, who ran around like they had just won the lottery. He stood beside me, watching the dogs play, and let out a low chuckle. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. "A dog park where your house used to be." I smiled. Neither did I, but it feels right. Over the next few weeks, the park became a symbol of the neighborhood's new era. People who had once lived in fear of the HOA's absurd rules now had a place to gather, completely free from the kind of control Marjorie and her cronies had exerted for years. Families came with their dogs, kids played in the open space, and for the first time in a long time, people actually seemed happy. Even with the HOA gone, remnants of its corruption still lingered. Some homeowners were still fighting to get back the money they had been scammed out of, and others were struggling to repair the damage caused by years of intimidation and threats. I knew that while my battle was over, others still had a long road ahead. I made it a point to help wherever I could, using the platform I had built from my case to bring attention to other homeowners facing similar issues. My fight had inspired people across the country to challenge their own HOAs, and lawsuits against corrupt associations were popping up everywhere. Marjorie's downfall had become a lesson for other power-hungry HOA boards. Abuse your authority, and you will be held accountable. The final chapter of her story came months later when Greg called me, his voice practically shaking with laughter. "You are not going to believe what just happened," he said. I raised an eyebrow. After everything we had been through, I wasn't sure anything could surprise me anymore. "Try me." He could barely get the words out between his chuckles. Marjorie tried to move into another HOA neighborhood. They rejected her. I let that sink in for a moment before laughing myself. The irony was almost too perfect. After spending years ruling over an HOA like a dictator, she had been deemed unworthy to live in one. The same ridiculous standards she had enforced on others had come back to haunt her. I shook my head, still grinning. "Karma really is something, isn't it?" Greg sighed, finally catching his breath. "You know what the best part is? She's staying in a rundown rental outside the city now. No HOA, no rules, just a tiny house with a broken fence and an overgrown yard." That was the final piece of closure I hadn't even realized I needed. She had spent years controlling every aspect of people's homes, deciding who was worthy and who wasn't, only to end up in a place where she had no control over anything. It was poetic justice at its finest. As time passed, things slowly returned to normal. My wife and I moved into a new home in a different neighborhood, one without an HOA. It felt good to be somewhere fresh, without the memories of what had happened looming over us. The new house wasn't just a replacement for what we had lost. It was a new beginning. My kids loved it, my wife felt at peace again, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder waiting for the next fight. Greg and I remained close, and we often joked about writing a book about everything that had happened. Maybe one day, I told him. But for now, I just want to enjoy life. One evening, as I sat on my new porch watching the sunset with my wife, I thought about everything that had led us to this point. The battles, the setbacks, the victories. It had been a long, exhausting journey, but I wouldn't have changed a thing. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under the HOA's rule. I turned to my wife and smiled. "We made it." She squeezed my hand, resting her head on my shoulder. "We did." As the sky turned shades of orange and purple, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The fight was over, the storm had passed, and we had come out on the other side stronger than ever. And for the first time in months, I finally felt at home.